I never thought I'd watch my grandmother's century-old Victorian home vanish in flames while my neighbor Karen Whitfield stood across the street sipping coffee with a smirk. To the rest of the neighborhood, it looked like just another tragic accident, old wiring, bad luck, a house too stubborn to modernize. But I knew better. For months, Karen and her self-appointed HOA had circled me like vultures, measuring my lawn, snapping photos of my roses, threatening me with mandatory improvements I never agreed to. They believed I was just another homeowner they could bully into submission. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't only a homeowner, I was a federal judge. And unlike their past victims, I had both the patience and the power to fight back. The night my house turned to ash wasn't my defeat. It was the moment Karen made her most fatal mistake. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I'd love to see our community around the world. The morning it all began was deceptively ordinary. I sat on my porch swinging an heirloom that creaked with the same rhythm I'd known since childhood, watching the sun stain the clouds in shades of pink and gold. My grandmother's roses filled the air with their stubborn perfume, wild and untamed, spilling over the neat white fence that had stood for 3 generations. The purple trim of my Victorian home glowed faintly in the rising light, a color that once made tourists stop for photos. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the peace until I spotted her, Karen Whitfield. She walked with the confidence of someone who believed the world bent to her will, clutching an envelope like it contained the cure for cancer. Her designer tracksuit glistened faintly, and her oversized sunglasses couldn't quite hide the satisfaction curling at the edges of her lips. I'd seen her wear that exact expression in countless neighborhood meetings, always when she was about to unveil her next scheme. My stomach sank as she marched toward my mailbox, heels clicking like gavels, and slipped the envelope inside with exaggerated precision. Then, as if on cue, she pulled out her phone and began photographing my front yard, the roses, the antique wind chimes, even the porch swing. Her actions weren't subtle, and she didn't care. Karen's whole persona thrived on intimidation. She lingered longer than necessary, narrating into her phone like a reality TV star, final invitation delivered. Once she's in, every property here will conform. No more eyesores dragging us down. Her voice carried across the lawn with artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. I waited until she strutted back to her McMansion, gleaming beige siding, generic shrubbery cut with military precision, before I opened the envelope. Inside was a glossy brochure. Welcome to the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association building, a brighter tomorrow. The smiling stock photo families stared back at me like Stepford ghosts. A $5,000 membership fee, $350 monthly dues, and pages of mandatory modifications. My grandmother's purple trim out. The rose garden removed. Even the antique wind chimes, which had sung me to sleep for decades, were forbidden. But the worst part wasn't the list. It was the threat buried between the lines. Karen wrote in her tight looping script, "This isn't really an invitation, it's progress. You'll thank us later." My years in courtrooms had trained me to read between the words. This wasn't progress, it was coercion. I set the letter down, heart pounding, and began rifling through my old deed. The parchment crackled with age, but stood as a shield. My property predated any HOA covenant in this county. Legally, I was untouchable, at least on paper. That evening, I carried the envelope back to Karen's front door. Her doorbell chimed an obnoxious jingle, "We are the champions," as though she'd already declared victory. She answered, dressed like a neighborhood sheriff, complete with a shiny neighborhood watch captain badge pinned to her chest. "I've reviewed your invitation," I said, evenly, voice calm, with the practiced steadiness of someone who'd delivered verdicts that ruined lives. "And I'll be declining. This house has been in my family for generations, and its character will remain exactly as it island." Her smile curdled instantly, vanishing faster than steam from a kettle. She leaned closer, her perfume chokingly sweet. "You don't seem to understand," she hissed. "This isn't optional. Your house is surrounded by HOA members. You will join." I pulled a folded map from my coat pocket, the original property plat stamped and notarized. "Actually," I replied, holding it up for her and her husband Bob, who lurked in the background, "that's incorrect. My deed predates your little club. You have no legal authority here." The veins in Karen's neck bulged crimson, and for a moment I thought she might actually spit. But then her expression softened back into that familiar counterfeit smile. "Accidents happen," she murmured. "Old houses like yours? Well, they're unpredictable. Fires, structural failures, break-ins. It would be such a tragedy if your stubbornness cost you everything." Her husband's eyes flickered at mine through the window. He didn't say a word, but the way his hand lingered on his phone thumb, hovering like he was ready to call reinforcements, told me plenty. I recognized intimidation when I saw it. I turned away, refusing to let them glimpse the storm rising in my chest. Behind me, Karen called out, voice sharp as a knife. 1 week, Sarah. You have 1 week before the board meets. Think carefully. That walk back to my house felt longer than any I'd taken in years. Curtains shifted in nearby homes, faces peeking out to catch a glimpse of the showdown. Karen had her loyalists, neighbors who'd already joined her HOA empire. Their silence now spoke louder than words. I was the last holdout, the lone obstacle standing in the way of her perfectly beige utopia. That night I worked until dawn. I installed new cameras, checked the locks twice over, and documented every inch of my property with time-stamped photos. My instincts screamed this wasn't just about roses or paint trim, it was about control, money, and power. I'd spent decades watching greedy people cloak their ambitions in the language of improvement. Karen was no different, except she had the audacity to wage her war right in my backyard. As I sat in the dim light of my study, reviewing each detail with the precision of a judge building a case, one thought crystallized with chilling clarity: Karen Whitfield had no idea who she was dealing with. And by the time she found out, it would already be too late. The harassment didn't arrive with fire and fury, not at first. It crept in like termites, quietly gnawing at the edges of my sanity until I realized the infestation was deliberate. The very next morning, I opened my front door to find a neon orange citation plastered across it. Violation notice: lawn exceeds height limit. I stood barefoot on my porch, coffee steaming in my hand, staring at the ridiculous piece of paper as though it might burst into flames. My lawn, carefully trimmed just 2 days earlier, was barely 6 inches tall. But the fine print at the bottom demanded a $200 corrective fee, payable directly to the HOA. By mid-afternoon, the so-called inspection team arrived. Karen led them, clipboard tucked beneath her arm like a judge about to deliver sentencing. Beside her waddled Barbara, her loyal lieutenant, scribbling every word Karen spoke as if scripture. They measured my grass with a ruler. 11.5 inches, Karen declared triumphantly, though anyone with eyes could see it wasn't true. That's 3.5 over regulation. Barbara dutifully recorded the number. You're trespassing, I called from the porch, my voice firm. Legal steel beneath every syllable. This property isn't under your jurisdiction. Karen's smirk widened. We're only ensuring community standards, she purred, snapping photos of my roses with her phone. The irony nearly made me laugh. The roses she despised had won local gardening awards twice, while her chemically bleached boxwoods looked like soulless green bricks. Over the next week, the harassment multiplied. Landscapers I hadn't hired appeared at 7 a.m., their machines shrieking like war drums outside my bedroom window. Each time I told them politely they had the wrong address, and each time they replied the job order listed my name. Anonymous complaints poured into the Riverton County Code Enforcement Office. Officers knocked on my door at least 3 times, investigating fabricated violations, unsafe wiring, excess noise, an illegal structure in my backyard that turned out to be nothing more than my grandmother's century-old tool shed. Every encounter followed the same script. The officers would leave shaking their heads, acknowledging my documentation and the historical exemptions protecting my home. And without fail, I'd glance across the street to see Karen standing in her driveway, arms crossed, lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The war escalated when she installed 2 massive floodlights on her property, angled not at her own driveway but directly at my bedroom windows. At night, my house glowed like a crime scene. I filed a formal complaint with the city for light pollution, but I knew the point wasn't illumination, it was intimidation. Karen wanted me exhausted, humiliated, ground down into submission. Still, I refused to give her the satisfaction of cracking. My evenings were spent in quiet, methodical preparation. Every orange citation was scanned, every anonymous complaint logged. I backed up all security footage to an off-site server, something Karen and her board clearly didn't anticipate. The meticulous patience I'd learned from years on the bench now served a new purpose, building a case not in a courtroom but in my own home. It wasn't just paperwork either. I started noticing subtle patterns. Whenever Karen's board held their meetings, they chose her driveway directly outside my office window. I'd sit at my desk pretending to read case files while every snide comment floated through the air. She's bringing down property values. We need to deal with her soon. One eyesore can ruin the whole neighborhood. They thought volume gave them authority. To me, it only gave me evidence. Then came the psychological warfare. HOA members let their dogs relieve themselves on my lawn with suspicious frequency. When I confronted Karen with footage, she clutched her pearls and gasped, "Oh, my Bentley would never," as her golden doodle bounded off my property, leaving steaming proof behind. My mailbox was knocked over repeatedly, my garbage bins vanished only to reappear, tagged with violation stickers, and strangers started photographing my house at odd hours, murmuring about safety concerns. But the breaking point wasn't vandalism, it was fear. One Saturday evening, as I returned from the courthouse, I caught sight of two HOA board members loitering by my property markers with tape measures in hand. They whispered about easements, pointing at my fence as though plotting a surgical removal. My stomach twisted. This wasn't petty bullying anymore. They were testing boundaries literally and legally, waiting for the moment I slipped so they could pounce. That night, I scrolled through the recordings, my eyes narrowing. On camera, their flashlights lingered, not just on the fence, but on the utility boxes, gas, electrical, water. They weren't just cataloging violations. They were scouting vulnerabilities. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights off, the glow of my laptop, illuminating a fortress of files. I reviewed municipal codes, property rights, statutes, and precedents from similar HOA overreach cases. I even called an old colleague in the state attorney's office, careful to keep details vague, asking how far a private association could legally go before crossing into criminal intimidation. His answer chilled me. Depends how organized they are. If they're coordinated, it's racketeering. But you'd better have rock-solid proof. Outside, the wind rattled the dead chimes Karen had deemed non-compliant. I stared at them, hearing my grandmother's voice from decades ago. Sometimes, the best weapon is patience. Wait until they show their hand. I knew Karen. She was arrogant, addicted to control, and incapable of restraint. Eventually, she would overreach. And when she did, I'd be ready with evidence, with law, with the very system she believed she could manipulate. For now, I endured the petty tickets, the smears whispered at HOA block parties, the snickers when I walked past. Because beneath the veneer of their power, I saw cracks forming. And I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen pushed too far, before intimidation turned into something darker, something criminal. And when that moment came, she wouldn't be facing a neighbor she could bully. She'd be facing me, the one person in Cedar Hollow with both the patience of a judge and the authority to deliver justice. It was just past midnight when the sound of soft footsteps on gravel jolted me awake. At first I thought it was a raccoon rummaging near the roses, but the steady rhythm didn't match an animal. I slipped quietly from bed, my heart hammering, and pulled back the curtain. There they were, three figures crouched near my grandmother's rose garden, their silhouettes sharp under the faint glow of the street lamp. One of them carried a sprayer, the metal glint catching the light as he pumped and aimed directly at the roots of the bushes. I opened the back door slowly, phone already recording in my hand. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" My voice cut through the night like a gavel in a courtroom. Karen jerked upright, her designer pajama top glistening under the light. Her two accomplices, both HOA board members, froze like guilty schoolchildren. But Karen's smile returned instantly plastic and venomous. "Oh, Sarah," she cooed, her tone drenched in false innocence. "We're just protecting the neighborhood. These roses, they're invasive. The HOA bylaws are very clear." I stepped forward, the camera capturing every second. "They're not invasive. They're heritage roses planted by my grandmother in 1960. I have the original Gardening Society registration in my files." The board members shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward Karen. She waved them off. "Well, someone complained about the smell. And those thorns, they're dangerous for children walking by." "Children," I snapped. Behind my fence, on private property, my voice didn't rise, but each word was honed with the edge of courtroom precision. Before I could press further, Bob Whitfield emerged from the shadows, his bulk intimidating, his badge from his days as a fire investigator gleaming faintly under the porch light. "Let's not escalate this," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We're only trying to maintain safety standards. Nobody wants to live next to a jungle." I flicked the floodlight on, illuminating them all in harsh white. "What I see," I replied coolly, "are trespassers destroying private property, and I assure you this is being recorded." From across the street, I noticed an elderly figure peering through lace curtains, Mrs. Watson. Her rock garden had mysteriously been torn out weeks earlier, replaced by approved shrubbery after she caved to Karen's pressure. Now her gaze lingered on me, sympathy etched into every wrinkle. The next morning, I found the damage. Every rose bush blackened, their once vibrant petals shriveled and brittle. My chest tightened as I crouched to touch the soil. It reeked of chemicals. They hadn't just vandalized my garden. They had murdered living history, each bloom a memory of my grandmother tending the yard with careful hands. I clenched the wilted stem until thorns pierced my palm. For the first time, I felt fury, not just at Karen's arrogance, but at her utter disregard for legacy, for roots deeper than her shallow McMansion ambitions. But fury alone wouldn't win this war. I knew that better than anyone. Evidence wins. patterns win. And Karen had just revealed both. That afternoon, I drove straight to the Riverton County Records Office. Its air smelled faintly of dust and ink, the kind of place where secrets wait patiently to be discovered. For hours, I combed through property transfer records, sale deeds, and tax rolls. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. Every homeowner who had initially refused to join Karen's HOA over the past 5 years had faced mysterious misfortunes: fires, vandalism, sudden citations from obscure city codes. Within months, most sold their homes always at a fraction of their value, and the buyer without fail a shell company linked to Karen's family, Whitfield Holdings LLC. My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the documents. The scheme was almost elegant in its cruelty. Use HOA rules to harass. If that failed, escalate to vandalism. And if that still didn't work, accidents followed, fires ruled, electrical failures, insurance money, collected property sold. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the fluorescent ceiling. How many families had walked away defeated, believing they were alone? How many legacies had been erased under Karen's iron fist? The records clerk glanced up from his desk. "You all right, Judge?" He knew me from previous county business, though he never asked why I was here tonight. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just connecting dots." Back at home, I didn't bother with sleep. I spent the night installing new high-definition cameras, this time with hidden placements and cloud backups encrypted off-site. I wired sensors to my gates, alarms to my windows, and even set up a motion-activated floodlight that would trigger the second anyone set foot on my lawn. If Karen wanted a war, she'd get one. But this wouldn't be a war fought with roses and rulers. This would be fought with evidence, with law, with patience sharpened into a blade. Around 3 in the morning, as I tightened the last bolt on a camera mount, I caught sight of Karen's window. She was awake, her silhouette framed in soft lamplight, phone pressed to her ear. Watching me, waiting, plotting. I met her gaze through the glass, unblinking. For the first time, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt crease her perfect posture. Perhaps she sensed it, that beneath my calm surface, beneath the ruined roses and the endless citations, something had shifted. She had escalated the game. And she had no idea that by doing so, she'd step squarely into mine. The day my house caught fire began like every other predictable, ordinary, almost boring. I sat in my chambers, black robe draped over my shoulders, presiding over a corruption trial that had already stretched into its 3rd week. The courtroom smelled of coffee and old wood, and the defendant's attorney was droning on about mitigating circumstances when the door burst open. My clerk Emily, pale as parchment, rushed in. "Your Honor, your house. It's on fire." The words froze the courtroom. My gavel clattered onto the bench as I tore the robe from my shoulders and ran. Every step down the courthouse steps felt like sinking through ice. My heart slammed against my ribs, each beat screaming the same words: "Too late, too late, too late." 15 minutes later, I screeched to a halt on Maple Street. Thick black smoke clawed at the sky, blotting out the morning Sunday. My grandmother's purple trim, the pride of our family, was swallowed by roaring orange flames. The antique porch railings sagged, charred to coal. The roof groaned as if crying in agony. A century of history, of memories, of love, it was all being devoured before my eyes. Firefighters swarmed with hoses, their faces grim under their helmets. The heat hit me like a wall, blistering my skin even from a distance. I stumbled closer until Chief Alvarez intercepted me, sweat streaking down his soot-marked face. "It looks electrical," he said, shouting over the roar. "These old houses, the wiring, dangerous stuff." "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I knew better. Only yesterday I'd received my annual inspection, every circuit passed with flying colors. My wiring was pristine. This wasn't coincidence." I grabbed my phone, thumb trembling as I opened the security feed. The cameras had been my lifeline, my shield, but the screen showed nothing. Every recording cut off at exactly 3:00 a.m., 4 hours before the blaze. Someone had disabled them. This wasn't an accident, it was sabotage. As I stood there, hands shaking with fury, my gaze locked across the street. Karen. She leaned casually against her pristine SUV yoga pants, spotless blonde hair glinting in the sunlight. In one hand she cradled a steaming cup of coffee, in the other her phone, and on her lips that smirk, the same one she wore when she watched my roses die, when she plastered my door with citations, when she told me accidents just happen. Around her clustered the HOA board, whispering, pointing, pretending to cover their mouths while laughter flickered in their eyes. My nails dug into my palms until blood welled. They thought this was their victory. They thought fire had finished me. But they'd made a fatal mistake. I spotted Bob among the onlookers. His boots caught my attention, the same distinctive tread I'd captured in footage of the Rose Garden vandals. only now fresh mud clung to them, mud streaked gray with ash. His stance was relaxed, but I saw the twitch in his jaw. He knew I'd noticed. Karen strutted forward, dripping mock concern. "Oh, Sarah," she cooed, her voice pitched just loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This is just terrible. If only you joined the HOA, we could have helped you modernize. Fires like this happen when people cling to the past." She sipped her latte, slowly savoring every word. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron. Not yet. Not here, not in the street. My neighbors watched, their faces pale, some sympathetic, others wary. Fear of Karen's wrath held them in silence. But I would not give her the spectacle she craved. Instead, I lifted my phone and dialed 3 numbers. First, my contact in the FBI. Second, the state attorney's office. Third, a private investigator I trusted with my life. Each call was short-clipped, but each one lit a fuse Karen couldn't see. From the corner of my eye, I saw her expression falter just for a moment. Her hand trembled slightly as she raised her cup. She didn't know who I was calling. But she sensed it, that I wasn't broken, that beneath the ashes, I was already planning her downfall. When the flames finally died, my home was unrecognizable. The windows shattered into jagged teeth, the roof half collapsed, the porch a blackened skeleton. The roses were gone, reduced to char. I picked up a fragment of purple trim, charred at the edges, and held it tight. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to find the strength to fight back." I looked at Karen one last time, her smug silhouette framed by smoke. She thought she'd won. But as the embers crackled around us, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. From that moment, my grief hardened into purpose. While Karen paraded around the neighborhood, spinning rumors that I'd burned my own house for insurance money, I worked in silence. I combed through county archives, tracing property transfers. I studied tax records, zoning changes, financial statements, and every thread led back to her. One name appeared again and again: Whitfield Holdings, LLC, the buyer of every burned property in Riverton County over the past 5 years. The owner, Karen's sister-in-law. It wasn't just harassment. It wasn't just bullying. It was organized crime. And Karen had just handed me the match that would light her entire empire ablaze. I didn't allow myself to wallow in the ashes of my home for long. Grief is a luxury when you know the enemy is still moving pieces against you. Instead, I pulled every ounce of energy into what I do best: building a case. Not a civil dispute, not a minor complaint, but the kind of airtight case that makes even seasoned prosecutors sit up straighter. The first real lead came from an old friend of mine, Daniel Wu, a real estate investigator who had once testified in one of my federal trials. We met at a diner 2 counties over, far away from Karen's prying eyes. Daniel slid a thick folder across the booth table, his face grim. "I don't know what you're involved in, Sarah, but this pattern, it's bigger than I expected." Inside the folder were property records spanning 5 years. Each burned or vandalized home, each harassed homeowner had sold to the same buyer within months. Whitfield Holdings, LLC. And after every purchase, the property was rezoned within weeks, often for commercial development. The profits were staggering, millions siphoned through consulting fees, safety upgrades, and suspiciously timed insurance payouts. I felt a chill as I flipped through page after page. The victims weren't faceless. I remembered some of their cases tangentially. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lost her house in a garage fire just days after refusing HOA membership. The Patel family forced out after a gas leak nearly destroyed their home. Each story echoed mine like a sinister refrain. Daniel tapped the last page, a spreadsheet of cash deposits. Notice the timing. Every deposit follows right after an accident, and all the deposits link back to Karen's family trust. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Racketeering," I murmured. "Pattern, profit, organized intent. This isn't just harassment, it's RICO." The next step was riskier. Through a mutual acquaintance, I arranged a quiet meeting with Melissa Chen, the HOA's former treasurer. She'd left suddenly 2 months earlier, citing family obligations, but rumors suggested something darker. We met in the corner of a quiet coffee shop, her hands trembling as she passed me a USB drive. "I can't keep this secret anymore," she whispered. "Karen forced me to alter the books. Cash deposits from shell companies, expenses labeled as landscaping or community improvement, but I knew what it was. And when I tried to back out, she threatened to call ICE on my cousin. She knows everything about us. Everything." Her voice cracked, and I realized just how deep Karen's intimidation ran. Not just homeowners, but her own board members were pawns in her empire. That night I didn't sleep. I loaded the files into my laptop, combing through every transaction. It was all their bribes to city inspectors off the books, payments to developers, even coded memos about ensuring non-compliant properties meet fate. But the most damning evidence was in the emails. Karen bragging about our next target, Bob discussing how to make it look electrical, and casual mentions of board members being on site during suspicious incidents. They weren't even careful. Their arrogance had left fingerprints all over the crime scene. I documented everything, creating a timeline that linked each harassment campaign to eventual accidents and profitable sales. The FBI agents I'd called after the fire were already circling, but I knew they needed more than suspicion. They needed undeniable proof that this was a criminal enterprise. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Melissa agreed to wear a wire. The FBI fitted her with a discreet recorder and sent her back to Karen, pretending she wanted back into the fold. The recording that night was a symphony of self-incrimination. Karen sipping her Chardonnay, laughing about which house would mysteriously catch fire next. Bob boasting that he still had friends in the fire department willing to rubber stamp reports. Karen threatening Melissa directly, "If you ever talk, you'll vanish faster than those roses next door." When the FBI played me the recording, my stomach turned, but my resolve hardened. Every word was another nail in their coffin. I kept digging, though. If Karen was bold enough to destroy my home, she wouldn't stop there. I found maps in the city archives buried under zoning proposals, a planned highway expansion, a commercial shopping complex, luxury condos, and right in the center, my property. My house had been the keystone of a multi-million-dollar scheme. Suddenly, everything made sense. The roses, the trim, the endless citations, they were never about aesthetics. They were about breaking me, forcing me to sell, clearing the path for developers already in bed with Karen. But she had miscalculated. She thought she was dismantling a stubborn neighbor. In reality, she had awakened the one person in Cedar Hollow with the knowledge, connections, and iron will to dismantle her entire empire. I sent the evidence to the FBI in neatly organized files, each piece numbered, each thread connected. My training as a judge made the structure second nature, opening argument, supporting exhibits, conclusion. But this time, the argument wasn't in a courtroom. It was in the shadows, preparing for the day I would drag Karen and her cronies into the light. And I promised myself something as I closed my laptop that night: I wouldn't just win this battle. I would burn down everything Karen had built, not with fire, but with justice. Outside, her floodlights still blazed into my windows, but I didn't mind. Let her watch me through the glass. Let her believe I was just patching my wounds. She had no idea I was already plotting the endgame, and that the very tools she had used to intimidate others would become the weapons of her undoing. The ashes of my home still smoldered, but out of them I was building something far more dangerous than she could ever imagine, a case that would not only destroy her HOA, but every crooked deal tied to her name. And when the time came, she wouldn't be facing an ordinary neighbor. She'd be facing Judge Sarah Nguyen with the full weight of federal law behind me. The more I uncovered, the more I realized Karen's arrogance had been her undoing. Criminals often make the same mistake. They believe their intimidation and control are enough to keep people quiet. But intimidation crumbles when faced with the cold precision of evidence. Melissa's recordings were damning, but I needed more. The FBI had opened a preliminary file, and an assistant U.S. attorney I knew personally agreed to review my evidence. Still, I knew prosecutors skeptics by nature. They would want physical proof, something that tied Karen directly to the fires and property seizures. So I went hunting. For days I buried myself in city archives, scanning zoning maps and development plans. That's when I found the missing puzzle piece. A set of maps marked Cedar Hollow Redevelopment Project. They weren't public yet, tucked away under pending review, but the outlines were unmistakable. A new shopping complex, luxury condominiums, and a feeder road for the upcoming highway expansion. The centerpiece of the plan: my land, the property where my Victorian home once stood. The developer listed on the proposal was Horizon Real Estate Partners. I knew that name. It had appeared on Melissa's ledger of payments. Digging deeper, I discovered the company's board included Karen's brother-in-law. The whole thing was a family racket. That night, I spread the documents across my dining table in my temporary apartment. Photos, bank records, property deeds, zoning maps. Each piece linked Karen's empire tighter together. By the time I was finished, my case file looked more like an indictment. But I couldn't stop there. The FBI agreed to fit Melissa with a second wire for a more dangerous meeting. This time, the goal wasn't casual conversation, it was confession. We staged it at Karen's house during one of her private board gatherings. Karen's driveway glittered with luxury cars while laughter spilled from the open windows. Later, listening to the recording, I felt both fury and satisfaction. Karen bragged openly about the fire at my home. We had to send a message, she said, between sips of wine. She was the last holdout. Now the land's clear for Horizon. Bob chimed in with a chuckle. Made sure the cameras went dark too. Amateur mistake, leaving them unshielded. Every word was another nail in their coffin. But Karen still didn't know who I really was. To her, I was just a stubborn neighbor with no allies left. That anonymity was my greatest weapon, and I intended to use it. Still, the harassment didn't stop. If anything, it grew bolder. My burned-out lot was labeled a public nuisance. HOA members paraded potential buyers past it, gesturing like it was already theirs. Karen even proposed a special assessment fee to clean up my property money that of course would funnel back into her pocket. I documented it all. My photos captured HOA board members loosening fence posts, shining flashlights over my gas meter, inspecting utility boxes as if plotting their next move. Their audacity was astounding, but arrogance blinds people to how exposed they really are. Meanwhile, my allies worked quietly. Daniel uncovered land transfers, proving Karen had pulled this scheme in other counties. The FBI traced payments from Horizon back to Whitfield Holdings. And Melissa, though, terrified, continued to feed us information from the inside. One evening, I sat at my desk staring at a single email Melissa had forwarded. It was from Karen herself to the HOA board. After next week's meeting, the judge will have no choice. We'll declare her property condemned and Horizon can take it from there. She had written the word judge. My breath caught. Did she know I read the line again slower this time? No, she wasn't calling me a judge. She still believed she was just talking about me as a problem. She didn't realize the irony, that her problem was in fact a federal judge who'd spent decades dismantling more powerful criminals than her. That realization steeled me. It was time to stop merely collecting evidence. It was time to prepare the battlefield. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the Cedar Hollow Community Center. Karen planned to unveil her redevelopment proposal to the neighborhood, a glossy presentation of beige condos and community revitalization. Melissa tipped me off. Karen intended to push a vote to declare my lot a nuisance and move forward with condemnation proceedings. Perfect. I began to plan my appearance like a general preparing for war. I organized my evidence into binders, financial records, zoning maps, surveillance stills, Melissa's recordings. I called my contacts at the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's office, ensuring warrants were ready. I even packed my judicial robe into a briefcase folded neatly beside the documents. On the night of the meeting, I stood outside the community center, my heart pounding. Through the window, I could see Karen strutting to the front of the room, her designer heels clicking on the tile floor. Her board members shuffled papers, the projector humming to life. The audience was filled with my neighbors, some loyal to her, others cowed into silence. Karen raised her gavel, the cheap wooden one she loved to brandish at meetings. Order, she declared, her voice booming. The property at 247 Maple Street has been deemed hazardous and a public nuisance. Tonight, we move forward with redevelopment plans. The room buzzed with murmurs. Karen's smirk widened as she gestured to her PowerPoint slides, filled with photos of my burned home. As you can see, it is an eyesore. Our community deserves better. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the briefcase, and pushed open the door. The sound echoed like thunder. Heads swiveled. Karen froze mid-sentence, her smile faltering for the first time. I walked down the aisle, my heels clicking against the linoleum floor, every step deliberate. When I reached the front, I placed my briefcase on the table and opened it, spreading the photographs across the surface. These, I said, my voice calm but sharp, are images of your board members trespassing on my property. Here are bank records showing cash deposits after each suspicious fire. And here I held up a transcript from Melissa's recording, are your own words, admitting to arson. The room erupted in gasps. Karen's face drained of color, her gavel slipping from her fingers. This is slander, she stammered. You can't prove any of. But I wasn't finished. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled my judicial robe from the briefcase and draped it over my shoulders. The fabric unfurled like a banner. I am Judge Sarah Nguyen, I announced. And as of this moment, you are the subjects of an active federal investigation into racketeering, fraud, and conspiracy. The silence that followed was absolute. Karen's eyes bulged. Bob rose to his feet, but before he could move, the doors burst open. FBI agents swept in badges, raised voices commanding the room. Federal agents, everyone remained seated. Chaos erupted, but I stood still, my robe heavy on my shoulders, my evidence spread before me. For the first time since the fire, I felt whole again. And for the first time, Karen finally understood who she had been at war with all along. The chaos inside the Cedar Hollow Community Center felt like a dam finally breaking. Years of whispered intimidation, fake citations, and veiled threats cracked wide open under the weight of flashing badges and steel handcuffs. I stood at the front of the room, judicial robe over my shoulders, while FBI agents swarmed around me, corralling HOA board members who had once strutted these aisles like royalty. Karen was the last to be touched. She shrieked when the agents pulled her arms behind her back, her designer bracelet clattering to the floor. "This is unlawful," she screamed, thrashing against their grip. "I'm the president of this neighborhood. You can't treat me like a criminal." One agent leaned close, voice steady as stone. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, racketeering, and suspected arson. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The color drained from her face. For the first time since the day she set foot on my property, her confidence cracked. Her gavel lay abandoned at her feet, its cheap wood splintering under the heel of an agent's boot as he escorted her toward the door. Her husband Bob fared no better. He tried to bolt for the emergency exit, but two younger agents intercepted him easily. When they cuffed him, his boots, those same ash-streaked soles I'd seen in the footage, scuffed helplessly against the linoleum. The rest of the board sat slumped in their folding chairs, the bravado drained from them. Some cried, others sat in stunned silence. My neighbors whispered in the back rows, their eyes wide, some covering their mouths, as if afraid to breathe too loudly, and then a ripple. Applause. It started with Mrs. Watson, the elderly woman who had watched Karen destroy her rock garden. She rose from her seat, clapping softly at first, then louder. Soon others joined in, tentative at first, then building until the room thundered with it. Their applause wasn't for me as an individual. It was for the release, the sudden collapse of the fear that had gripped them for so long. I closed my briefcase slowly, letting the sound wash over me. For years, these neighbors had been pawns in Karen's empire, too afraid to resist. Tonight they saw something different, that the tyranny of one smug woman and her cronies could be shattered by evidence law and the refusal to bow. When the noise settled, Mrs. Watson shuffled forward, her frail hands trembling as she reached for mine. Tears glistened in her eyes. "We should have stood with you sooner," she whispered. "But you gave us back our voices." I squeezed her hand. It's never too late to stand up to bullies. The agents filed Karen and her board out the doors, their protest drowned by the hum of radios and the clicking of cuffs. Outside, I glimpsed red and blue lights strobing against the night sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. For once, those lights weren't a symbol of intimidation, they were a promise of justice. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the days that followed, the arrests made headlines across Riverton County. Local reporters camped outside the courthouse microphones, thrust forward, shouting questions. "Judge Nguyen, is it true you lived in the house that burned? Were you targeted because of your refusal to join the HOA? How many neighborhoods has Karen Whitfield's group infiltrated?" I answered carefully, never giving more than the investigation allowed. But inside, I burned with the weight of what I knew. The emails, the payments, the recordings, there was enough evidence to level not just Karen, but an entire network of developers, inspectors, and crooked officials who had fattened themselves on the misery of ordinary families. Meanwhile, Karen's narrative crumbled. Her lawyers tried to spin her as a dedicated community leader unfairly maligned by an overzealous neighbor. But the footage of her spraying my roses, the bank records, the wire recordings of her mocking fire, victims, it all shredded her defense. Each revelation was another crack in her porcelain mask. Still, Karen tried. In her arraignment, she lifted her chin and addressed the court as though she still ran the HOA. "I was only protecting property values," she declared. "I wanted to keep our community safe and beautiful. If a few sacrifices had to be made, well, that's progress." Her words ignited gasps and mutters across the courtroom. I watched from the bench, robes heavy across my shoulders, resisting the urge to let emotion seep into my expression. Judges are taught neutrality, but I was also a victim, and listening to Karen reframe criminal arson and extortion as sacrifices tested every ounce of my restraint. The FBI's evidence dismantled her facade piece by piece. They played recordings of her instructing board members to make it look electrical. They showed surveillance stills of Bob near my property markers at midnight. They traced shell companies back to her family accounts. And most damning of all, they revealed that every burned home in Cedar Hollow had been insured for far above market value just weeks before their fires. The jurors' faces told the story before their verdict ever did. Shock. Disgust. Rage. My neighbors began stepping forward, too. Mrs. Watson testified about the night men with sprayers destroyed her garden. The Patels described the gas leak they barely survived. Mrs. Rodriguez broke down as she recounted losing her family photos to a garage fire that insurance adjusters called bad luck. Each testimony was another blow to Karen's crumbling empire, and for every voice that spoke, I saw her shrink smaller in her designer, suits her arrogance dissolving under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Through it all, I kept my focus on the evidence. Justice isn't about vengeance, I reminded myself. It's about truth, about restoring balance. Still, as I watched Karen squirm in the defendant's chair, her once smug smirk erased forever, I allowed myself one fleeting thought: sometimes justice and vengeance look an awful lot alike. When the court recessed for the evening, I stepped outside into the crisp night air. The courthouse loomed behind me, its stone pillars bathed in light. Across the street, reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing, but I barely heard them. My eyes were on the sky where smoke no longer rose above Cedar Hollow. My house was gone, but something else had risen in its place: resolve. The trial was still ahead, but in that moment I knew the tide had already turned. Karen had built her empire on intimidation, on fire and fear, and now, stripped of her gavel, her coffee cup, her staged authority, she was nothing more than a defendant facing the one thing she could never control: the truth. And I, the last holdout she tried to break, was the one holding the scales. The morning of the verdict felt different from any other day I had ever walked into a courtroom. My hands, usually steady from decades on the bench, trembled slightly as I straightened the folds of my robe in front of the mirror. This wasn't just another case. This was my life, my home, my family's legacy laid bare before the law. Karen had tried to erase it all with gasoline and arrogance, but now the system she thought she could manipulate was about to crush her. The courtroom was packed wall to wall: neighbors, reporters, victims from other counties who had recognized Karen's pattern in their own tragedies. The air hummed with anticipation. Karen entered wearing an expensive navy blue suit, her hair styled as if presentation could erase guilt. But her eyes betrayed her. They darted around the room, landing on me at the bench. I saw recognition flicker, followed by raw panic. For the first time, she looked small. The prosecution began by laying out the evidence in meticulous detail: wire recordings of Karen laughing about electrical accidents, financial ledgers showing hundreds of thousands funneled through Whitfield Holdings LLC, security footage of board members tampering with fences, utilities, even my roses. Each piece landed like a hammer. When Melissa took the stand, her voice shook but held steady as she described how Karen forced her to cook the books. Every time there was a fire, she whispered, Karen made me deposit cash from Horizon Real Estate. If I refused, she threatened my family. Her testimony was devastating, the kind that jurors never forget. Then came Bob, once her shield, now her betrayer. After hours of cross-examination and mounting evidence, he finally broke. She planned all of it, he admitted, his voice flat. Every target, every fire. My job was to make the report say, accidental. I couldn't fight her anymore. Karen exploded, leaping to her feet. Liar. You're all liars, she shrieked, her voice echoing through the chamber. The bailiffs rushed to restrain her, but the damage was already done. The jurors had seen her mask slip, revealing the ruthless tyrant beneath. One by one, the victims testified. Mrs. Rodriguez weeping as she clutched a charred photo album, the Patels describing how their grandfather's ashes were lost in a blaze. Mrs. Watson speaking of her sleepless nights after strangers destroyed her beloved rock garden. Their stories painted a portrait of terror spanning years, a campaign of fear waged under the guise of community improvement. When the jury finally returned, the silence was suffocating. I scanned their faces, grim, resolute, certain. The foreperson rose and read the verdict, guilty on all counts. Karen collapsed into her chair, her perfectly tailored suit crumpling like paper. Tears streaked her carefully powdered face as the reality set in. 25 years. Bob and the remaining board members each faced 15. The courtroom erupted, some gasping, some cheering, some crying tears of relief. For the first time in years, Cedar Hollow was free. I sat motionless on the bench, my gavel heavy in my hand. I thought of my grandmother's roses, of the purple trim she painted with such pride, of the nights I spent listening to wind chimes that would never sing again. Justice had arrived, but it carried a bittersweet weight. 6 months later, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air where my home once stood. Construction crews rebuilt the Victorian from the ground up using blueprints I had salvaged from county archives. The trim gleamed purple, once more bold and defiant against the beige monotony Karen had tried to force upon us. Neighbors who had once looked away now stopped by with casseroles, flowers, and apologies. We shared meals, stories, laughter. A new association was born, not an HOA, but a true community group. No dues, no fines, no intimidation, just neighbors helping neighbors. Block parties replaced block inspections. Instead of citations, there were potlucks. The Patels hosted the first gathering in their backyard, their children chasing fireflies, while Mrs. Rodriguez passed around her famous empanadas. Laughter rose into the night air, carrying with it the sound of healing. I keep a reminder of that dark chapter on my desk at the courthouse. Not the gavel Karen loved to bang, nor the citations she plastered to my door, but her coffee cup, the one she dropped when the FBI stormed her meeting. It sits there, a silent trophy, a daily reminder that arrogance always breaks under truth. And every morning as I sip my own coffee in the garden beside freshly planted rose cuttings, I watch the sunrise over my restored home. The wind chimes sing again, faint but resilient, carrying my grandmother's memory. Karen thought fire would destroy me. She was wrong. Fire tempered me. It forged me into something stronger. Because justice, like a rose, always finds a way to bloom again, even from ashes. Life will always bring people like Karen, those who mistake control for leadership and intimidation for strength. They may win battles through fear, but they can never win the war against truth. What happened to me is a reminder that silence only feeds bullies. The moment we speak, the moment we stand, their power begins to crumble. Sometimes we have to lose something precious to gain the courage to fight back. My home was reduced to ashes, but from that loss came a community reborn, stronger and kinder than before. If you're facing your own Karen, remember patience, documentation, and courage can turn the tide. And when justice finally arrives, it's worth every sleepless night. Tell me in the comments, have you ever faced someone who tried to bully or control you? How did you fight back? And don't forget to subscribe, there are more stories like this waiting to be told.